Hello, folks. This is Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters here at WJOP 96.3 FM, Joppa Radio, Newburyport. I'm excited to be here, and I'm particularly excited to be here because tonight our conversation is going to focus on having courageous conversations around race and racism. And I think that's really important. One of the reasons why I wanted to express the importance of folks leaning into this is because, as many of you may or may not know, I have partnered with the YWCA and the PEG Center for Art and Activism, and we recently launched a series on anti-racism, bringing community together to engage in those needed conversations about differences, about race and racism. We launched a series on March the 5th in which I gave a lecture at the UU Church here in Newburyport titled Being Black in White Spaces, a Brave Conversation. And I was excited, particularly when I looked out and saw the number of people who attended my talk. I was especially excited because folks seem to want to lean in. The responses I've gotten by way of email have been simply fantastic. I will say a lot of the faces that I did see were kind of some of the same faces of folks who want to lean into this work, who want to have these conversations, and who want to talk about the importance of discussing race and racism here in the 21st century. I'm always looking for fresh new faces to engage and to participate in these conversations, primarily because the more people who lean into this work, who lean into matters of listening, means that we're going to have a more vibrant, a stronger, a more inclusive community, and we can continue to model this to the rest of the world, to other towns, other cities, in a way in which we can be transformational in terms of doing this. I was really excited about that March 5th event. And to add to that, on March the 21st, we'll have our second series of having conversations around race and racism and thinking about anti-racism on March 21st at 6:30 p.m. at the PEG Center for Art and Activism. Stay tuned to that. I suspect we're going to have a large number of folks, maybe so large that we may even change the location, and that could be the case. If I were you, I would pay close attention to the website at the PEG Center and kind of, get a sense of what's happening. But more than anything else, I would come out and I would listen. We're going to operate within a fishbowl gallery where we have invited, I should say, a number of BIPOC folks, a number of Black people to come together to have a conversation among themselves about what has it been like for them to be Black in white spaces. And this is kind of a listening session, especially for white allies and also for white folks who are looking to grow within this paradigm that's necessary and needed here. These are the kind of conversations that I wish were taking place, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. But those conversations are challenging. And we know they're challenging, particularly because in the 21st century, where we need to lean in, we need to talk about elements of race and racism, there's been tremendous amount of legislative pushback about talking about race, especially in schools. Optimal, a great place, a place that can be safe but also brave, where young folks can think about why this work is needed, why is it important? And that's hard, particularly because if you watch the State of the Union address, the State of the Union address is really probably not a great model for listening, for people to sit back, to clear their minds, to open their ears, to think about the differences that we operate, that we navigate through, to find ways in which folks can circle around and think about the needed aspects of why there's so much contentiousness within our world, within our country, within our communities. When I watched the State of the Union address, I heard a lot of clapping and cheering, same old ceremonial stuff that we've become accustomed to observing. But I also observe grown people, professionals, our national leaders who lack the ability to sit, to listen, and to hear what the other side has to say. That is difficult to do. And how are folks supposed to do this, especially looking to national leaders? I'm going to say Congress is probably not the place to look for, or look to, I should say. I wouldn't go to Congress. I would start focusing on your own neighborhoods, your own communities, your churches, your schools, your synagogues, your mosque, all of those places in which you can have dynamic discussions about our differences and how do we collectively lean in, engage in a cheerful manner about the things that are divisive, that are hard. Educate and inform folks that they are doing harm, they're triggering, they're creating problematic environments for all of us. That's what's necessary. It's one of the things that I seek to do with my students. I always try to find spaces where we can pull students together and they can engage in constructive discussions guided by rules. We call these norms or community norms, conversational norms. And before each conversation is had, these norms are shared. And they're shared in a way to remind participants that we may not always agree. But the goal, of course, is to lean in, to listen, to hear what someone has to say, to do so without judgment, to refrain from being antagonistic as we think about our varying opinions on different matters, different topics that may be there too. Our students, my students, I should say, are really good at doing that. And one of the things that I thought about doing is, writing the Speaker of the House, the Speaker of the Senate, and saying, hey, you should come and you should observe what these conversations look like. The work of diversity, equity, and inclusion has really fallen under a lot of tremendous political pressure lately. Pressures in which folks see DEI as being divisive, but that's not the case at all. Looking to make people feel guilty, particularly white folks, about their own racial identity. And that's not the aim either. The aim, of course, is to sit, to focus, to listen, to respond, and to think about the needed work that has to transpire here. Tonight, as we think about these courageous conversations, as we think about race and racism as one aspect, but there's so many other things when we think about identity matters, I want to kind of set some rules for folks who may want to, one, start some of these conversations, whether it's at your dinner table or, as I already stated, in your public library, at your mosque, synagogue, or your church, within your school community. These are things that are needed, and these things are needed by leaders, community leaders, to push them forward. Doesn't have to be folks my age. It can be young folks looking and seeking to navigate these spaces in a ways that are productive, in ways that are not anti-productive, I should say. Having conversations about race and racism can be sensitive and challenging, but they are essential for fostering understanding. That's the key thing. Fostering a sense of understanding of one another in a way in which, as we're thinking about things of race, we don't place judgment on other folks. At the end of the day, we do navigate this beautiful planet as human beings. Empathy. Without empathy, it's difficult to listen and to learn, to refrain from being combative, not seeking to understand how those who deem themselves marginalized as being the enemy, or those on a different side, for example, who may think about, well, you're placing judgment on me because I see the world in a different way. That's not what we're looking to do. Empathy is challenging. A lot of folks say they are empathetic, and I believe most people are. But empathy requires self-evaluation or reflection, a sense of learnedness, a willingness to discover things not only about other folks, but really to get to that particular place of positionality, one has to step back and think about their own self and why that's important, especially if we're going to be the positive change agents we want to be here in this world. That's what we're looking to do, and that's what's needed. So here's some thoughts and some ideas that I want to share with you, my listeners, about ways in which we can do that. Before you look to create, attend, and formulate courageous conversations around race and racism, the first thing that's necessary and needed, of course, is to find a way to do some self-evaluation and education. I think that's needed. Before engaging in discussions about race and racism, just take a little bit of time to inform yourself about the history of racism. Understand the difference between race, racism, and ethnicity, and how those figure into different capacities in different spaces. It looks different, of course, if you're on the continent of Europe or on the continent of Africa than say, being here in North America, here in the United States. But it's important to think about that. It's important to understand the language and what things such as systemic inequalities means. And why do systemic inequalities produce friction among people from different races? And oftentimes, if you look at the narrative, the history here in the United States, these things have been framed and have been unfolding for a long period of time. This is not new. Things have exploded, of course, since the death of George Floyd. And yet, we've seen tremendous pushback on these conversations. I would think more than anything, now is the time that corporations and schools and institutions and hospitals should lean in even more so to think about why we should have these conversations in our spaces, in our workspaces. These are the things that can bring about amazing transformations. These are the experiences that marginalized communities want people to have. They want them to grow a sense of empathy and understanding their struggles and the dynamics that's there. Why thinking about the language of anti-racism in a positive way and not a bad way? Because again, the basic fact is anti-racism is just doing things to combat, to fight the problems of racism within this country. Things that people hear all the time, and I think these are really good places to start if we're thinking about educating ourselves, such as finding some books that may be helpful. Watch some documentaries. I know a film that recently came out, and I haven't seen this film yet, but it's on my radar, and I'm going to get around to it eventually, is called Origins. And this is based off the book Caste, which I have read. And it's a wonderful read. And everything that I've heard is that the movie is just simply fantastic. Listen to some podcasts, right? Listen to my show. Whether you agree with everything I say or you don't, I'm sure there's a point, one point that you can listen to and say, you know, that brother Carson, Eddie, he has a point there. I want to lean in and I want to think about that. All right. And these things don't always have to come from people such as myself or noted or learned authors or scholars, but they can come from your neighbor. And if your neighbors aren't those of a diverse background, seek those folks out, but only do so as you're educating and informing yourself once you've put yourself in a position to really think about why you have the positionality that you do. And what is it that you're hoping to ascertain in your own formulation of growth that's there? A challenging thing, And I think this is true for a lot of us. You know, it's true for me. And this is something that I continue to practice quite a bit. And I've gotten better at it over the years, which is saying much in the sense that, you know, I'm a talker. And while I'm a talker, I do believe I have incredible ears. And I like to be an active listener. I like to think about, when discussing race and racism, why it's crucial to listen actively, right? To follow every word and how that syllable is being pronounced, and the passion, the fear, and those elements that people have are trying to drive. Where are they coming from? What is it that we want to get out of this? And again, listening is not so much about ourselves, but it's about the narrative of someone else. It's about their storyline. It's about recognizing that those, especially folks who come from oppressed and marginalized communities, have experiences that made things challenging for them. What are those things that are challenging? What are the fears? In my lecture on being black and white spaces, a brave conversation, I told an overwhelmingly predominantly white audience that I've experienced things that create a sense of trauma in me. It makes me nervous. It puts knots in my stomach. That heatedness that we've all felt, that sense of fear about what's going to happen next, especially when there are not a lot of folks who look like me who are doing this. These things are very real. Avoid interrupting or dismissing others' experiences as they're leaning in, as they're sharing. But sit and listen. Pause your mind, right? And meditation is really good at helping us focus on trying not to jump ahead, right? Listening and thinking about what someone has to say that feels in opposition to maybe what you're thinking about. Oftentimes we let our minds race ahead of ourselves, and the only thing we can focus on is how we're going to respond versus how we're going to sit back and we're going to listen to someone else's narrative when it comes to topics of race and racism. Really getting to a point where we want to strive to understand someone's viewpoint, their perspective, with empathy and with an open mind. Wow. Imagine if Congress walked into each session and thinking about being empathetic, thinking about having an open mind to needed conversations and debates that are going to happen. I don't even think I like the word debate. I love the word conversations, having discussions about these things. Debate already entails the sense of antagonism that's going to happen. I am ready to argue why you're wrong. And that's not what we're looking to do. A sense of acknowledgement, I think, is important, particularly acknowledging one's own privileges. Pause for a second, and as I stated at the beginning, be reflective. And as you reflect on your own privileges and biases, and I'll be the first to say that I have my own biases that are there, acknowledge them openly in conversations about topics of race and racism. And it could be about a litany of things that we disagree with. But think about that for a second. How do we acknowledge our privileges, and acknowledge our privileges in the ways that can be problematic and cause interference for productive discussions about contentious topics such as race and racism? Recognize that privilege can shape your perspective and influence how you perceive and interact with others who are different. When you meet someone who is fully empathetic and they lean into their privilege and they understand what that means, you can feel that. I feel that. It's one of the things that brings a sense of calm and perspective to me when I think about this work. Being mindful, I think, is key. Especially being mindful to language, in the language that we use. I try, and I will be the first to admit, I'm not always perfect. And I always welcome someone to pause me or to correct me, maybe not in a moment, but to have a conversation with me about why my language or the language of someone else could be problematic. Use language that is respectful, inclusive. Here's a word that people seem that is taken on its own toxic masculine identity when people use this word, but I don't think that's the case at all. And that is sensitive, being sensitive to the needs of others as we're thinking about this, being sensitive to the experiences of marginalized communities, being sensitive to a semblance of willingness to learn and grow. Wow. I mean, imagine if Congress walked in and before they adjourned, they sat there, and as they're beginning to engage and start, someone says, I want to share some norms, some community norms about how we're going to listen today, how we're going to engage and have a conversation. Think about how that meeting with your boss, or how that session at church, or how that lesson at school or in a boardroom or any kind of corporate meeting would be if we established a semblance of rules and norms before we did this. Transformational, folks. I mean, wow. Everyone should write Congress and give them my advice, my recommendation. And of course, I'm not saying anything that's original. I'm not sharing anything that's earth-shattering. I'm saying something that's difficult and challenging for all of us to do. Find a way to seek common ground as you're leaning into these courageous conversations about race and racism. Some people would say, well, Eddie, there is no common ground if you have someone who is just being in diametrical opposition to the realities and experiences of oppressed and marginalized people and what they're navigating and feeling. And there's truth to that. But I think there has to be a semblance of common ground when you step into a space looking to learn, looking to grow, looking to navigate through these ways in which we formulate who we are. Look for common ground and shared values that can serve as a foundation for constructive dialogue, right? Agreeing to disagree, but being aware of where you're disagreeing, especially since we're trying and we're working to be empathetic to the experiences of other people, especially when we talk about marginalized groups that are there too. Focus on areas where you can work together. You can address issues of racism and inequality. Come together to really frame a foundation of why people disagree. In my experience, there are different kind of populations. There are the people out in the world who are just, they're hardened racists. These people, they're in hate groups in a KKK, and it may be difficult to move them. And that's difficult. There's a brother, and I can't remember his name. You can probably Google him, where he meets Klan members and he moves them to give up their Klan robes, to operate and move into society in a way in which we can all live and operate and congregate together, right? You have that population of folks. And then you have the folks who are oblivious to the issues of race and racism and systemic inequalities. They're unaware that inequity still exists in the 21st century, and there's real trauma and experiences that marginalized people are having and they continue to face today. That's something that's there, right? For that population of folks who are just unaware, who are oblivious to these things happening, I think that's the population that has to be moved the most. Those who believe that, I've never had a racist thought or said anything. I just don't care about that stuff. It's not important in my life. and I'm just going to really focus on my day-to-day operations. That goes back to a previous point I noted about privileges. And to have that kind of privilege, it has to be nice, where you don't have to worry or think about it. As I mentioned to an audience of predominantly white folks during my March 5th talk, I talked about the fact that I wake up and I'm aware of my race. I think about it constantly, 24/7. And one of the reasons why is because, one, I'm proud to be who I am. I was built, I was constructed, I was designed in this way. It is who I am. And the experiences I've had because of my racial background have formulated my identity in a way, in ways that have allowed me to be who I am, to be a person that I would consider an expert on these topics, but also a person who's aware that I don't know everything. And I have so much to learn, so much work that I still have to do in terms of growing. And I think that's the mindset that we all have to have. And then, of course, there are the folks who, particularly the white people who are the most engaged, who will raise their hand and they will say, I have work to do and I have to continue to do that work. I need to be the kind of change agent for society because I have leaned in so much that I do think about this. I think about my privileges and I think about the benefits my privileges have granted me. I don't see the world as a colorblind society, nor do I see the world in a way that disavows the trauma experiences by BIPOC folks. That's not these folks. These folks are deeply and immensely engaged. These are the folks, right, who are creating anti-racist series over at the PEG Center, for example. These are folks who are leaning into the words every week of Reverend Rebecca over at the UU Church in Newburyport. These are folks who are really thinking about why it's important to do this without looking to publish a book on anti-racism or listening to the works of Tim Wise about do this and do that, right? They're taking a different approach. And yet some of these folks may lean into the Tim Wise, right? And Tim Wise, he has profited quite a bit on thinking about race and racism. But he has great messages. As a person who's read a number of his books, who's listened to a lot of his lectures on YouTube, those things are definitely there. The one thing that I think is hard for folks when it comes to this topic, and one of the reasons why we try to stay away from this, is because of our level of discomfort. Folks, you're going to be uncomfortable. Discomfort is normal. Being uncomfortable in these things is called being human. Generalization, for the most part, most people do not like tension. They don't like conflict. I try to avoid conflict at all costs. I try to de-escalate situations that I see emerging. Sometimes when a white person says something that's inappropriate, I try to pause for a second and think about what's the context by which this person is saying that? How do I talk to them in a way that probably will make them a little uncomfortable, but also hopefully in a way that they're going to listen to me, right? Conversations about race and racism can be uncomfortable for so many ways and so many reasons, but discomfort can be a sign of growth and progress. It's something that we all experience when we are being transformational. Lean into discomfort rather than avoiding it. And use it as an opportunity to learn and deepen your own understanding about the narrative, the complicated narrative, the dark history, the dark narrative of race and racism, particularly here in the United States. We should seek to respect boundaries. Respecting the boundaries and comfort levels of others when discussing race and racism can allow for growth among all of us, regardless of our racial background. Avoid pressuring people to share their experiences or opinions if they're not comfortable doing so. I always ask folks to raise their hand or to share if they feel this is a part of who they are, or if they've contributed to something that is not productive, making sure, though, that I add a caveat that you don't have to do this if you're not comfortable. That's hard. And if anyone's been around me, I'm notorious for saying, if this is your experience, raise your hand. And whether I should do that or not, that's a good conversation. And again, I welcome anyone to come have that conversation with me, because it can be productive when we think about the need for boundaries. Recognizing boundaries also allows us to be mindful of things that can trigger folks in different ways. Trigger folks who may feel a sense of being paranoid. And again, paranoia is a serious element of trauma that's there. That's key. When I started to show off today, one of the things I said, and one of the things that I thought was important, is that people need to educate themselves. Read a book, listen to a podcast, listen to this show, do a number of countless things to become informed. But yet, taking in all that information only goes so far. You have to take action. And part of taking action, of course, is now that you've really become a more learned individual, what do you do with the information that you've now ascertained in your own growth element, moving towards that sense of progress? Conversations about race and racism are important, but they must be accompanied by concrete actions to address systemic inequalities and injustices within our society. These structural systems that are there are going to remain there unless we actually do something. I am really, really proud and excited about the anti-racist series that we've launched here in the Newburyport community. And part of that series is going to culminate into us taking action, right? One of the things that I've asked folks to do, particularly white folks, is to do a lot of listening. But yet, over the course of doing this listening, one of the things we want to do is we want to create action steps. And during our last gathering as a part of this series, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to get together and we're going to create action steps to making Newburyport a more anti-racist community in a way that models what other communities should look to do. This is not going to be something where Eddie Carson is going to dictate and say, okay, let's do this. But it's going to be a lot of brainstorming, a lot of pen to paper, exercises on what does this mean? What are the ways that we can actually make the type of changes that are needed, the kind of changes that will be restorative, that can bring about human growth and illustrate our capacity to be amazing people in this world. And that is a hopeful aspect of me. That, I believe, is something that definitely can happen. Look for opportunities to advocate for change, support marginalized communities, and work towards creating a more equitable society. I already have some thoughts by which we can do that here in the Newburyport area, in the North Shore, in this greater area that's here. And those are the things that are here in my head, but those are the things that cannot be executed without other folks' help. Again, it can't be just about me. It cannot be just about Eddie Carson. A thing that I don't do very well, and I'm working towards doing that, particularly now, these days, as I sit back and I reflect on all the work that I've done, all the whether it's on my campus, in the greater community, through my talks or my publications, through the show, through my teaching, through my activist work, is self-care. And I'm not always good at self-care. We hear this quite a bit, that practicing self-care is a must. And I am here to tell you, I am the world's worst at doing that. Because I haven't always taken great care of myself, it's led to elements at time of stress, disappointment, fatigue, and a whole litany of things that are necessary. Engaging in conversations about race and racism can be emotionally taxing, daunting, is probably another word I would use. We have to remember to prioritize ourselves in terms of seeking the support that we need when it's needed, taking breaks when necessary, stepping away from this work may be the thing that's needed, right? I'll say that is something that I've never done. One of the things that I oftentimes tell people is, if I step away from this, then who's going to do it? I have to show up and I have to do it. I always see my work and the things that I do is almost like a clock, and you're watching the seconds and the minutes tick away, and yet you're thinking, I've got to rush in. I've got to do this, because if I don't, then it may not get done. I am working, right? And I will admit this. I am working on allowing other folks to have that space to do that, where I can step back. And there are some folks here in this area. There are folks in this community who are absolutely doing an amazing job at carrying the mantle forward. I have faith. I have trust in them. And I also want to remind those folks, those who are listening, that you have to take care of yourself too. We all know what fatigue feels like when we get there, and we know what it means to really delve into the neededness of anti-racism work and the stress that can happen. I hope you'll take all of these thoughts, these ideas, these suggestions. I would say that what I've just shared with you here on Race Matters, WJOP 96.3 FM, Joppa Radio, Newburyport, are more than opinions. These are things that have been framed by not just academics, not just scholars, not just ministers and religious folks, but these are things that have been operationalized, if I can use that language, to bring about some of the changes that are necessary. You know, I don't think I'm making this up right now. Again, like I always tell listeners, it's important you hear something and you're not sure about it, check it out. Right? Research it. Send me a note. Send me an email in a constructive way. But I remember reading once that when Brother King died, his heart and the stress on his heart was that of a man well into his 60s or 70s. And Brother King was only 39 years old when he was assassinated. And yet he had gone through so much trauma in trying to bring about the neededness of anti-racism within society. He was arrested 32 times. His house was bombed. Crosses were lit up in his front yard. He was not allowed to enter a lot of spaces. He faced criticism not only from white people, but he also took criticism from Asian folks, indigenous folks, and black folks. Yes. I believe the statistics was the fact that on the eve of King's assassination, roughly around 55% of black people disagreed with some of the central elements of his campaigns, especially his challenges towards capitalism and militarism in the dawning age of the Vietnam War. Those were things that were there. So that's what we want to think about. I want you to find this show on YouTube. Listen to this episode. And if you didn't take notes, go back and take notes. and practice all of these things collectively. And if practicing all of these things collectively is overwhelming, just pick a couple, maybe a few things to say, this is what I'm going to do. And this is what I'm going to do is I think about how I can lean in more to courageous conversations about race and racism because they're so needed within society. Folks, thank you for chiming in. I'm Eddie Carson. You're listening to Race Matters here at WJOP 96.3 FM Joppa Radio. I hope you have a good day. Be well.